welcome back to Kisses on Magazine podcast. I'm Dr. Jenny, and today Keeley has returned because it was so awesome talking to her last time. And this time we're talking about fantasy. Welcome
Yay!
back, Keeley. Mhm.
Thank you. It's so wonderful to be here. And I cannot wait for us to dive all the way into fantasy. It's one of my very favorite topics. So,
Thank you. So what I realized about fantasy, and, sexual fantasy, I should say, is a lot of times when people talk about it, they talk about what is the top five fantasies, so top three, for men, for women, for partners, for whatever. And they talk about in those terms, which is all well and good, but they don't talk about how do you talk about it? How do you talk
mhm,
about it with your partners?
mhm. Right.
So, so what do you recommend?
Yeah. So, first off, I think I want to back up and share a little bit like how I think about fantasy. So,
Mhm.
when I'm talking to people or exploring different ideas with people, looking at eroticism, seeing how things aren't working because they show up in my office because things aren't working. I normally am thinking about a model that I created in my head, actually based on sitting in a sex therapy training and not knowing what people were talking about when they were talking about fantasy. So the model was born out of trying to understand how fantasy fits into the erotic world. So if you imagine a circle and you divide it into three parts, one part is relationships, love, and intimacy. Another part is erotic embodiment and sensation based experiences. And the other part is creativity, anticipation, and fantasy. So, whenever I go into the space of like looking at like what is fantasy,
Right.
I think about this whole world that for people to feel balanced in their erotic life, which means they feel satisfied, content, open-minded, forward-thinking, just that feeling of balance in general. You don't feel like off kilter. Fantasy is a part that has to be engaged. And I think because fantasy can go anywhere in your head. You can go anywhere you want, and some fantasies are acted out and some are never acted out. Some we share with our partners, some we keep completely private, some we may come up more with certain partners than others. I mean, it's this whole huge space that we have very little language to talk about, and zero education for the average person around like how does erotic fantasy fit into your world. And I remember being one of those people. So whenever I have clients who show up and we inevitably stumble into the space of fantasy and they say I have had none, I'm like,
Uh-huh.
yes, I remember being there, and all of the people who I had had sex with were like, tell me your fantasies. And I was like, I don't know, what's the top five fantasy that women have? I would just grab one and say
Yeah.
it, even though it didn't actually relate to me or my body or any of my thoughts or turn ons.
Right.
And so I think when we think about fantasy, I mean, understanding what the top five, 10, whatever turn ons, I think normalize the experience for people. So they feel like, oh, I'm not a big weirdo or totally off kilter.
Right.
But what's true is that we all probably have fantasies that are in the normal category. And we all also have fantasies that are totally off that scale out in some ether world that makes you feel really vulnerable and anxious or worried to talk about. And when I talk with clients about that, I also think of like a straight line across. And one side is something you want to do before you die. Like you absolutely want to do this sexual thing before you die. You know
Yeah.
that. And the other side is like, I never, ever want to do that, but it really turns me on. And there's so much space in between. And so, especially when we start to look at fantasies and we start to talk about things with our partners, it's really important to assess like, yes, I'm bringing this up because at some point in my life before I die, I want to try it. Or I'm bringing this up because it turns me on. It's sexy to talk about. I want to share and be vulnerable and let you into my erotic fantasy life. But I'm very clear. I will never, ever want to do this in real life. And I think when we start to talk about fantasies that way, it opens up a bigger space so people don't feel like, oh, my partner brought this fantasy to me now. We have to do it. Because oftentimes that's not the case. And that really keeps people from letting their minds explore and kind of go out into that space of, what's sexy to me? Like what
right,
gets me excited? What gets me going?
right.
There's my whole introduction to fantasy.
Yeah. That's awesome. And I hope people realize that who've been listening, hello, that she said a lot. So, and take from it what applies to you. Instead
Right.
of thinking to yourself, in my opinion, oh, I must do everything. I must
Right.
try everything Keeley mentioned. No. How does it apply to you? Ask yourself that question.
Right.
So one
Absolutely.
thing that you mentioned, if you don't mind talking about for a couple of minutes, or even a minute, is the person who doesn't have a fantasy.
Right.
Because that person, based on what's come at them media-wise, even based on a song like Mariah Carey's Fantasy song,
Right.
based on even that, you think to yourself, how come I don't have a fantasy?
Yeah.
I'm
Right.
listening to these lyrics,
Yeah.
So let's talk about that, but just at least give it some time.
Absolutely. No, I think it's really, really important to speak to folks who feel like I have no fantasy because I had no fantasies, which
Mhm,
again, why I sort of created this model. And what I think what's it's not that there is no fantasy, there's nothing that turns you on, that there's nothing that you can connect with that turns you on. It's just oftentimes that you haven't been set up with the appropriate tools and space and comfort and sort of shedding of the shame layers and giving
mhm,
yourself permission to look at what turns us on.
mhm,
One of the places that people really get stuck with fantasy, especially, which I hope we'll have time to get to today, is like how you share fantasy, is that they think they have to have it all figured out before. Like
mhm,
before they go into it, they have to know where it's going. And
mhm.
I actually think one of the most exciting things about fantasy is that you have no idea where it's going, that it
Yeah.
could go really anywhere. But there's this like, there's a box that people often want to put around it. Like,
Mhm,
I want group sex, I want threesome, so this is how it's going to look. One of the exercises I work a lot with people, uh, not necessarily where I start with folks who don't have fantasies, but I say like, okay, let's have you close your eyes, take a couple deep breaths, get a little mindful. Imagine there's three doors in front of you. And behind each door is something sexy that's happening. And sexy could be anything. It doesn't have to mean even genitals are involved. It could really be anything. And so I have people imagine they open a door, they peek in, and they close the door. They open the second door, they peek in, and they close it. They open the third door, they peek in, and they close it. And they just stand back and they feel, okay, what was it like to peek in? Like how was that for you? All these mindful experiments. And then we say, like, okay, let's go into one door. Which one's calling you the most? And
mhm,
we open that door and we go in and we just hang out and we see like, okay, what's happening in the scene? What's the movie? Can you tell me about it? Which for many people is a very scary thing to talk about what they're actually seeing in their head. And
right,
we just move through it in kind of like a now zone of like, what are you seeing and what are you seeing now? And it helps to build the confidence. I often talk about it as like paint by numbers. I
mhm,
kind of date myself when I say this because the younger folks don't really know what I'm talking about. But if you have a piece of paper
mhm,
and there's the paint by numbers, which means the shapes are drawn out and there's the little number on the bottom, it tells you what color to put on. The art is made for you and you're just
mhm,
filling it out. And in many regards, people who don't have fantasies tend to be either those who've gravitated a lot to porn or have a lot of shame and just don't allow themselves to sort of open into that space.
mhm,
It can also be that if we go back to the balanced human sexuality model, they've gravitated in their eroticism towards the other categories and just haven't explored the other space. But excuse me. So what we're essentially saying is like, let's take the paint by numbers off. Let's just give you an open blank canvas and let you create. And to become an artist, like you just throw a bunch of paint for a while and you learn and you take your time and you kind of hone your craft. And with fantasy, it's a lot like that. It's trying it on, giving yourself the space and staying in the moment and just seeing what wants to happen next. So it's really hanging out in that eroticism and just seeing and making a safe space and it builds. It takes time, though. I normally tell clients that are truly walking in and they don't have fantasy at all, like we're talking 5, 6 years before they're going to be able to easily access sort of in that moment on a dime, share with a partner, feel comfortable. Like it is a pretty long process to create from scratch and become
Right,
this fantasy artist, if you will.
right.
But it's entirely possible for people.
Well,
And
it's
it will
not,
probably look totally different than anyone else's, just like a thumbprint, as it
right,
should, because fantasy is this deeply vulnerable, unique experience inside all of us, actually.
right. And it's not just that, it's giving yourself that permission to take the time.
Right.
Instead of thinking, oh, we have to do it immediately. No, um, it's a process. It takes one step before the other, and then
Right.
you might even slip on a step, and then you have to start back over.
Right.
If you do, you do. It's not
Right.
doesn't mean there's something wrong with you, especially if, like we said, if you have never had a fantasy. And so it's allowing that to happen. And I'm
Right.
sure it's awkward at first, and you're wondering what is going on here because you haven't felt that sensation before, and your mind is giving you permission to do it. And you're
Yeah.
like, whoa, so yeah.
Absolutely. And I normally
Yeah.
tell clients, like, if we don't get a little uncomfortable in there, if you're not sort of surprising yourself with like, wow, that I just saw that, that just
Mhm,
happened. And
mhm,
wow, that turned me on. We're kind of not going down the wrong direction. But it
mhm,
takes time to be able to trust yourself enough to allow that creative fantasy to move. It really does.
right.
And just learning, right, just learning to follow the energy, and inevitably you'll go places where you're like, that's not quite right,
Mhm,
when you're talking with a partner and you're sharing these out loud with a partner, you're like, that didn't that's not going anywhere, right? And so you just
right.
rewind, you backtrack, you go, I'm going to go back to that place because that direction didn't feel right. Like it's just is a completely normal part of sharing fantasy, versus again this idea people think they have to have it all figured out before they open their mouths or before they let their brain go. And that's completely, I hate to say it's the wrong way, but it's a very limited way of exploring fantasy. You're not really going to get access to the in the moment turn on. You're going to
Right.
get this cookie cutter. It's supposed to look this way, playing it safe, which I don't know. I'm all for not playing it safe. So,
Mhm. Well, yeah, if you have a partner that you feel comfortable enough and not playing it safe as you
right.
put it, yeah, definitely. But it's feeling comfortable not just with yourself, but your
Yeah.
partner. So,
Right. Right. Yeah. How we bring it into our partnerships,
right.
especially if there hasn't been space,
Hmm.
is a slow and delicate dance, oftentimes.
So
Um,
what happens for you in the session is that they bring it up to you and they need help, or you bring up the topic and ask how they're doing in that regard.
how does it show? How do we talk about fantasies and sessions? It
Yeah.
depends. In couples work, it sort of depends where the couple is and what's going
Mm,
on. Inevitably, with most people that I work with, we'll sort of stumble upon like where are your fantasies, what's your relationships with fantasies,
mm,
how creative do you feel? And you can kind of tell people who have a really robust, rich, comfortable fantasy life. It's like, we don't really need to do too much work poking around over there. And
right.
pretty quickly, if people are sort of feeling like they've been dreading their whole life the question of like, what are your fantasies? Because for some reason in our dating culture or our sex culture, there's this question, and it is one of my biggest pet peeves. It drives me nuts. I drill sergeant into my clients' brains. Like, you're not allowed to ask this question this way. That and ghosting is like, I'm up on people about that. I just not okay with the ghosting thing. But when we want to know another person's fantasies, we don't get to just ask, what are your fantasies? Especially not during acts of sex. It
Yeah.
is very off-putting to the person receiving it. And
Mm,
speaking from experience of how many times people had asked me that, and I was
mm,
one of those people who had no fantasies, it was like, ah, what, like, what? I'm just in the moment, feeling my body, and now you're asking me to talk about something, and
right,
it's a question that often really throws the energy off. And unless you know a partner super well, and you know they have a rich fantasy life, and you're like, oh, baby, what have you been thinking about today? Like, I want to
mm,
know. That's okay. Most couples are not there. So it comes in this like, tell me your fantasies. The intention is placed well, like I want to know you more.
right,
Yet fantasies are incredibly vulnerable. To speak them is incredibly vulnerable. It is our internal monologue in our brain that turns us on.
right,
And so what I say to people is, you go first.
mhm,
Hey, I want to tell you some of my fantasies. Is that okay? How would you feel about that? And so you get permission, a yes or a no. This can happen depending on the people that you're with. It could happen while you're exploring each other's bodies or outside of the bedroom. And then after you share yours, after you go vulnerably first into that land and territory of sharing, then you can say, I'd love to know what some of yours are when you're ready.
yeah,
And that leaves the door open for somebody to come back and say, okay, they can either share right then, yeah, this is something that I've thought about. These are these things that are on my mind. This is what I think about. Or that space of like, either they don't know or they're not quite ready to share and they just need a little bit of time to think about that. So it's going first is the piece that a lot of people miss when they say, what is your fantasy? It's like they're putting it all on the other person. You be vulnerable. You tell me all your deep, dark secrets,
right,
and I'll just hang out over here eating popcorn, you know?
yeah,
Um, and I think it really misses what fantasy can hold between two people, which is this exploration into that vulnerable, playful, imaginative, creative space.
mhm. Yeah, and after they're done sharing, hopefully the other person shares next. That way they're not vulnerable too long,
Right,
Or
right.
they say, "Ooh, that sounds interesting," or something reaffirming.
Yes,
But,
yes. When I work with couples and we start to talk about how to explore fantasy, I always prep with once our partner shares,
mm,
the first thing we say is thank you for sharing.
mm,
Thank you for sharing.
mm,
When we're talking about it in sessions, when I'm working on it with people, it's
mm,
outside of the bedroom. So there's a slightly different container that's happening. Oftentimes people are being more vulnerable. But
mm,
yeah, if our partnership shares something with us, our first response is like, we want to say thank you for sharing. If it's not sexy to us,
mm,
I always encourage people not to say what's not true. If the fantasy was sexy, I hope you're easily able to say, like, thanks for sharing. That's really hot. I can't wait to know
yeah,
more. Like,
yeah,
is there more to that? But to be genuine about what turns you on, because sometimes
mm,
people share fantasies with us that aren't a turn on, or maybe parts of it are turn ons, or maybe we have some curiosity, or maybe we get worried. Does this person want to do this in real life? And I don't know
right.
how I feel about that. That's oftentimes
Or
the biggest fear.
they read the article, the top five fantasies, so they just share what they read instead of what is really their fantasy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right, right.
So that's not helping them or the relationship by misrepresenting themselves. So
Right. Well, I think sometimes when people don't know what turns them on, having some things to choose from can be really helpful so they can just try and see. It's
yeah,
actually one of the times I recommend porn is like, let's go try on some things and see if
mhm,
any of it's hot for you.
right.
Um, there's options to learn things about yourself in that space of, the erotic literature, the erotic audio, the erotic visual that can help people fast forward that process along and be like, oh, I never thought about that, but that's really exciting to me. And so, sometimes it's nice to just know, oh, other people think about this, and it starts to prime that space.
Mhm,
And it can feel safer, if one of your fantasies is one of those, like, actually don't even know if I know what the top 10 are. I know what the most I've heard from my clients are, but I mean, sometimes it can be helpful to know, okay, this one is like a more normal,
mhm,
more socially acceptable one. And so it feels
right.
safer to say, because there is gradation in terms of um, potentially how someone might react.
Mhm.
If you've never talked about fantasy in a partnership and you come in talking about like a medical play, which is, you know, nurse, doctor, blood, needles, all the, some, it can go pretty far into that space.
Right.
It could potentially scare your partner because you haven't set the foundation of what your expectations are, what it means to share, where
Mhm.
that other person's comfort is. So there is a process of like, we start down here with a new partner and we work our way up to different spaces, especially if we're using it in the bedroom as a point of turn on
Mhm.
versus just I'm sharing my fantasies with you because I want us to be close in that erotic space.
Right. So, but part of sharing is sharing that there are boundaries around your sharing.
Right.
So, right. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, everybody comes into my office, this would be primarily working with couples, right? Like one person's got a fantasy that they've held back in their couple for many years. They have been using it for masturbation, for looking through it with porn. They've never shared. It feels like this is just kind of the most common thing I see with people where, it gets tricky with the boundaries or we have to really look at the boundaries. And, they've been years down this path of this kink or fantasy. And the the other person knows nothing about it. They've left it entirely out of the couple's sexuality. So suddenly this person is like, I can't keep it out anymore. I want my partner to know. But their partner doesn't know this piece of them. They've actually been withholding it. And so the person who's been withholding coming forward is often changing the dynamic of the couple. And there's a deep fear, like my partner will never see me the same again once I tell them this fantasy. They're going to think of me differently. They're not going to think of me in the same light that they thought of me before knowing this. And what's true is sometimes that's accurate.
Mhm.
Sometimes it can really scare your partner depending on what we're talking about. And
What
so
the
there does,
fantasy is,
pardon me,
depending on the fantasy.
depending on where the fantasy goes,
Uh-huh.
yeah, and how sexually open people are,
Right.
in San Francisco where I work, people are predominantly pretty open, and so
Mhm.
um, most of the time people have at least heard of things,
Mhm.
but when I work with people, it's not always the case in San Francisco. When I work with people outside San Francisco, it's slightly more true. They're like, what even is that? Like, they just don't even have a context of where to put it.
Right.
So the partner's playing catch up in terms of just even understanding what this person's talking about. And there
Mhm.
does need to be a lot of space holding before the actual fantasy is shared around, how we hold it, all of those pieces. Because it isn't necessarily safe to just like dump onto your partner and think it's going to be an accepted experience because not
Mhm.
everybody is ready for that, is ready to hold it. Yeah.
And like you said earlier, some fantasies are just that they're a fantasy. They don't want to make it a reality.
Right.
So,
Many,
uh,
many people have fantasies that they don't want to make a reality. Yeah.
yeah, but they want the freedom to share it with their partner.
Yeah. Share it with their
Mhm.
partner. And also, there's this beautiful space where you can bring it in as a fantasy that you're talking about in the moment. So, what I
Mhm.
talk about with so many couples is like you can be telling the movie that you're seeing, behind one of those closed doors to your partner,
Mhm.
step by step, moment by moment, giving them all the information that you're seeing, taking them on a journey in, almost like you're reading a book to them
Right.
and letting them move through that experience with you without ever leaving your bedroom. You
Mhm.
could be in Fiji on an island and
Mhm.
I don't know. I mean, endless things
Right.
could happen.
Yeah.
Name it, anything could happen. And you never actually leave the safety and comfort of your bed.
Right.
Um, but because there's this question that a lot of people have, if I say it, I have to do it,
No.
which is
Mhm.
like my goal is to just like eradicate that. Like, can we
Right.
just take that out entirely and say like some things you want to do and some things you never want to do and some things you don't know and they're in
Right.
between.
Yeah, and sometimes you might want to, and then you start doing
Try
what
it.
it
And you're
is, and
like,
you're like, what is
yeah, that
this?
wasn't fun.
It
Yeah.
was a lot better up here.
Right.
So,
Well, and that's what I have to say to a lot of people who come in with these like hard, fast fantasies that they think they want to explore. I have to be the bubble burster, which is like, there's the fantasy where you are
right,
creating this amazing, wonderful, sexy turn on in your head and you're
right,
getting everything you want. Reality is very different because it's real
mhm,
other people, real life happening. Your
right,
body is going to respond the way your body responds. I work a lot with couples going to sex clubs,
mhm,
and oftentimes that's a fantasy, right? One person has a fantasy that they'll go to this sex club and these things will happen,
right,
right? This is like an exploration of a fantasy where people are like, I have to do this before I die.
mhm,
And the preparation is basically like, it's wonderful to have your fantasy. Let's explore your fantasy. Let's make room for your fantasy. And then when you go into this sex club, I can guarantee you with 100% accuracy, it will be completely different because the
mhm,
people you've made up in your mind that are going to be there, the reactions you're going to get when you're there, the
right,
connection you're going to have, the lighting, the smells, all of it. Even if you've seen
right,
pictures online, it's just going to be different because we're talking about real people and real life, not the
mhm,
fantasy. And
mhm,
so it's preparing for that and letting the fantasy influence actions, experiences, adventures, but not holding so tightly that it has to look exactly that way.
right. Yeah, giving yourself permission to be disappointed.
Right. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
a big one.
yeah. I mean, it's okay. It
Yeah.
doesn't mean that don't, poo-poo the fantasy. You just realize it has to stay in your mind. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and that's actually a really, really big one for men in particular that are interested in group sex, because in the fantasy that's gotten created inside of
mm,
their mind, wherever it goes, it often doesn't involve their actual bodies and performance. Like in their fantasy, their body's performing exactly as they would want, and they're getting
right,
all of this pleasure. But what's more true in those moments is that pressure's high, um, you're exposed in a way that you're not normally exposed. There's
mm,
lots of different energy depending on what scenario you're in.
mm,
And a lot of men actually are not able to get erections during those times. They maybe get it up a little bit, but then it goes away. And that can even, I mean, can be super disappointing, can be really frustrating for lots of different people involved. And it can stop people from exploring those things because they get stuck on like the first time, the second time, the third time didn't go well.
mm,
And I guess this isn't for me, which, you know, oftentimes when I work with people, it's like, well, it's not for you if it doesn't still feel interesting. Sure. Maybe it's just a fantasy that you don't actually enjoy.
right,
Oftentimes it's just getting comfortable with how different that experience is and slowing down and letting yourself actually be able to feel the eroticism. I mean, the performance pressure in those scenarios is really intense, and people I always have to burst. I burst that bubble almost every time a client comes with that fantasy that they want to enact because I think it's better in my office than in the moment.
right,
Prepare them a little bit.
right. Well, group sex is a very vulnerable thing,
Incredibly,
You're
yeah,
with it in a room or a house usually. It's a bunch of strangers.
right.
So, I mean, we won't, you and I could definitely have that conversation, but that's not what we're here to talk about. But when you said that, men, have certain things that kind of get in the way once, the fantasy happens. Does that happen for women, you find too? That they have
um,
hiccups?
I think not as profoundly. I think
Okay.
the piece around the performance piece is really tough because oftentimes the fantasy involves a particular type of sex.
Mhm.
And if you can't actually perform, then it really interrupts. And men are oftentimes pretty attached to their cocks getting hard and that being able to fulfill that experience. And when they're not able to, the feeling of, um, I've let everyone down, I'm not a real man. I mean, the wave of shame and disappointment and, all of these negative feelings are pretty strong.
Mhm.
Women. um, predominantly can just still engage, even if their bodies are in a little bit of a shutdown mode or in a lot of a shutdown mode.
Right.
So um, I don't, yeah, it's a little bit different. But again, I think in general, that transition from this has been a fantasy, and if you're in a couple and it's something you've really talked about a lot, and now you're exploring it, is often very different. Even if, say, someone has a fantasy about, like, I don't know, let's just go with like a librarian fantasy,
Mhm.
and they've talked it out and they've said, here's how I want it to go, here's how I want the scene to go. So it's like when people start to talk about fantasies and enacting them, then you like normally call them scenes. And so it often looks completely different because you're most likely not actresses and actors,
Mhm.
and you're going on the moment of what happens. So you may say like, okay, let's do this and this and this, and I want it to kind of go like that, but it's improv. It could go
Mhm.
anywhere.
Right.
And we really want everyone to stay connected to what turns them on. And so it's that space of like, okay, this is what turns me on. So this library fantasy is going that way, and
Yeah.
and it's that catching by surprise that I think is oftentimes so exciting for people. The anticipation. I mean, it's so much there in a new relationship.
Mhm.
We don't know anything about the other person. We want to get to know them. What will it be like? Will we kiss them tonight? Will they take our shirt off?
Mhm.
What will, that there's so much anticipation in a new relationship.
Right.
And that's one of the things fantasy can bring back in a longer term relationship, actually, is anticipation of not knowing where it's going, which I think
Mhm.
is why it's such a valuable tool for
Yeah.
the erotic world.
Right. And for the keeping sex alive, so to speak.
Yeah, right. Keeping
Yeah.
it flowing, keeping it
Yeah.
creative, right?
Right.
Right, because a category is creativity, fantasy, and anticipation.
Right.
It's that creative space of keeping engaged. Absolutely. Mhm.
What remind me what the three that you did in your
The
show?
other ones.
Yeah.
So relationships, intimacy, and love.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes, depending on who I'm working with, I might even say religion because it fits into that category of like, it's essentially like, how is your heart? How close do you feel to that person? It's more of
Mm-hmm.
the love making space, it's the intimacy space, it's the I'm here with you space.
Mm-hmm.
The other section is sensation or erotic embodiment or sensation based experiences. So that's actually, how are you feeling the touch?
Mm-hmm.
How is your actual body engaging in the physical experience? Like
Mm-hmm.
that grounded. I think of this as the center is like your genitals are the center of this. Your genitals are your actual pleasure center of your body
Mm-hmm.
and like physically the pleasure center of your body. And so, how is your whole body actually engaging in that sensation? And then the creativity, anticipation, fantasy is the head center.
Right.
So, it's the heart center is the relational intimacy piece, the sensation is that actual body center, genital piece. And then the creativity, fantasy is the head center,
Is that,
which head center means something very different than just using your head and being up in your intellect. And I think that's a place where people get really confused with fantasy because coming from your head with fantasy means you're not actually feeling your body. You're
mm-hmm.
just making it up and not connected to your own system. Where the
Mm-hmm.
head center means I'm speaking from an internal recognition, a mindful place that's allowing me to come forward with what is actually turning me on. So it's a very different experience of fantasy than just being in the intellect and trying to figure out like, what do I think my partner's going to think is hot right now? So I'm going to say that thing.
Mm-hmm. Is that where you put the brain? Is that put?
The head center in the brain. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
But I like to distinguish between, you know, the head center
Mm-hmm.
versus just being caught in an intellectualization process.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's a very different way of sharing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's a very different way of speaking. Someone speaking from a mindful place
Mm-hmm.
is speaking while they're feeling their body while they're speaking. Someone who's
Mm-hmm.
intellectualizing is just like up here and chitty chatty. And when we talk about actual delivery of fantasy,
Right.
there is a particular cadence, tone, connection that you're trying to get across. Now that's like PhD level.
Mhm.
But at some point, we
Yeah.
once you are getting them out and you're connected to them, we do want to work with how do we actually deliver? And
Hmm.
that part of staying connected to the body and being in the center is really important.
Well, what I like about what we're talking about today is the three things that you mentioned that in your circle is because I want to tell people there's more to it than just having the fantasy.
Right.
Because sometimes when you read, the top five fantasies or this for whoever, you read it and you think, oh, okay, I should be doing that.
Yeah.
But you don't realize, like we're trying to get a point across today, is there's more to it than that. It's
Mhm.
not just that simple. That having the fantasy is one aspect of it.
Right.
It's how does it connect to your relationship? How does it connect to you? How's your body feel about it? How's your mind feel about it? How much of the fantasy have you really thought about? Have you only thought about one component of it?
Right.
Or, you know what I mean? So, what I mean is, yes, it's wonderful. Have your fantasies, don't ignore them,
Mhm.
but don't think that it's a simple process.
Right. And it's pretty rare, but occasionally I have people I work with where their eroticism only exists in fantasy.
Mm,
They stay in fantasy. It's difficult for them to do connection with other people. They don't feel their body at all. It often coincides with an overuse of porn.
mm,
And so, the overuse of porn means they're actually not even in the category of,
mm,
I mean, they're technically in like a very small section of the creativity, fantasy, anticipation, but they're not able to use their full brain around it. I mean, they're in a paint by numbers situation. The porn is just
right,
feeding them the fantasy. They don't have to think of anything. They're
right,
just following along with what's happening visually and auditorially.
yeah,
And so,
right,
you know, there's no balance there. If we're
mm,
just in the realm of the territory of fantasy, there's no balance in the rest of the eroticism. And so people do feel like something's missing and they show
right,
up in office because it's like, this isn't, something's not right. Yeah.
mm. Right, they've limited the sexuality,
Right.
And most people that are sitting in the office or reading Kiss and Tell magazine or whatever it is that, even listening to the podcast, you don't realize that you have limited your sexuality, because I think, I've said in other podcasts and we might have said it last time, who teaches you that?
Right. I
Who
know.
teaches you this wonderful, complicated, glorious issue
Mhm.
is so many things.
Right.
It
Yeah.
is, it is listening to a song. A song can get you aroused. It is
Hmm.
seeing a painting. It, it is,
It's having your partner do the dishes.
yeah, it can be, right, it can be that simple. Yet it happens if you're paying attention to
Yeah.
that book. And it's not, I'm not talking about just sex. Who teaches you to pay attention to that part of yourself?
Mhm. Yeah.
When, so if your partner's doing the dishes, let's say using that example, and you go, oh, all right. Who teaches you that? Who
Right.
teaches you to recognize, you know what? That actually arouses me.
Hmm.
So if you do know it, and you see the point they're doing it, your statement to them is say, thank you for the arousal. And
I love that.
no gonna say, really? And they'll love the compliment. So
I love it. That's a great one.
but
Yeah.
you know what I'm getting at. We're
Yeah.
not taught that enough.
Mhm.
Society squashes
Right.
that part of us.
Right.
No,
Yeah.
it doesn't celebrate it. So,
No, I mean, we're told very specific things are allowed to be sexy,
mhm,
and it's a very small box, and
right,
it doesn't work for 99% of people. We're
Mhm.
much bigger, we're more complex, and also it changes
Right,
over time. So it's not about finding one thing and saying that's my thing. It's actually more about exactly what you're talking about is getting connected with that, the awareness of that sensation in the body, being able to identify it, feel it, let it move, and then communicate it,
right,
right? It's that consciousness that comes. And I think that's such an important part for people versus, okay, they just said three things. Well, the dishes don't turn me on. So something must be wrong with me. I should be, which is complete opposite of what we're trying to say here, which is
right,
stay open to your body, stay connected, slow down, notice the things that are happening around you that bring turn on, and
right,
let yourself start to get comfortable and communicate that because it will ever forever be evolving the things that
right,
turn you on.
right. And right. So using the dishes just because it turned you on that time doesn't
Right.
doesn't mean that time. So when they rush to do the dishes, thinking that turns you on, it does.
Right.
Then
Right.
give yourself permission to say,
Right.
well, that time it didn't. But it
Right.
doesn't mean quit doing the dishes.
Right. Yeah. I was just thinking the dishes are one I might just stick with. Like, yes, it always turns me on. No, I actually don't mind doing the dishes, but you
Yeah.
know.
But my other point is don't limit
Yeah.
yourself in thinking it always has to be this way. It
Right.
always has to be this position, you know, so that's
Right. Well, and you're actually speaking to something really important when we start to talk about fantasy with our partner is
right.
like, oh, I said this one thing one time. Or what happens a lot with couples as they're just starting to explore fantasy is they have a lot of boundaries because there's a lot of fear. I don't want to go there. I don't want to go there. I don't want to go there. Don't talk about this thing. Don't talk about that thing. Don't talk about this thing.
Mhm.
But as people feel more comfortable stepping into that vulnerability, the rules, the boundaries, they become more fluid. People open. And so somebody who came in and said, um, I don't ever want us to talk about anal. That's my boundary. I don't want to feel any pressure to talk about anal. Don't talk about your fantasies with anal. But then, so their partner goes, okay, I'm going to lock that up. It's going to be my fantasy. I'll fantasize on my own about it, but I may bring it into our relationship, but I won't talk about it out loud because I know that that's not for you, right? So there's this container of safety for the person who said that's my boundary. But
Right.
then that person over time is actually like, I could be interested to see how that would play in with fantasy. And
Right.
it can be confusing for the other person who'd locked that away for so long and decided that's who you are. You're a person who doesn't like anal. But now the other person comes back and is like, I'm kind of curious. Like maybe we can play with it. And so there needs to be this flexibility and this openness
Mhm.
of like, even if we're starting with a hard boundary with ourselves to be open of like maybe I could open to that. And there's the biggest piece there is not putting pressure on our partners. Like if our partner has a boundary, that's where the boundary is.
Right.
And it's not like you should really like this thing because I like it, you should give it to me. It's letting the partner know, "Oh, okay, I hear that's your boundary. It still turns me on. Let's talk about how it can come in fantasy or not, and I respect your boundary." And respecting each other in that process, particularly not telling anyone they're gross, disgusting, wrong, fucked up, must have problems. I mean, all of
Right.
those things. Esther Perel said years ago, I remember hearing this, that fantasies are so vulnerable. If they feel shamed, they will go back underground and into a secret garden and you will never see them again.
Right.
The other person will never see them. So it is so important when our partners start to share and when
Mhm.
we start to share to let our partners know, hey, like, we got to check the shame at the door.
Yeah.
And if something makes you scared and worried, let's talk about it, but we don't judge, we don't tell people they're disgusting. We just get curious, we ask questions, and you never have to do anything you don't want to do. Ever. At any point, at any moment, during any sex you're having, if you want to stop, you stop. That's just
Right.
fantasy or not.
Yeah. Consent. There's a perfect T-shirt for this at Kiss and Tell Magazine shop. Consent is my aphrodisiac.
Right.
So
Absolutely. Yeah.
consent always matters on everything. You
Right.
know, judgment, they can say at the door. The other side of the door, not inside the house,
Right.
outside. But thank you, Keeley.
You're
Awesome.
very welcome.
Wonderful topic. Thank you, everybody. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And we'll see you next time. Keeley coming back. Thank you.
Thank you.